Good morning and welcome back to Channel 514 and SPK Plus for another episode in our series Exploring Ancient Literature. I hope you're having a great week and that you're ready for the Feast of Our Lady's Glorious Assumption tomorrow. But what we're going to do this morning is to discuss some of the classic Egyptian texts dealing with stories about the traditional Egyptian gods. So these would be mythological texts, and we won't get into any of the stories in which the king Osiris is murdered by his wicked brother Set, and then Osiris's son Horus has to defeat Set and come into his own as king. But we will discuss those next time, and we'll primarily be dealing with two texts, the contending of Horus and Set, and Plutarch's letter to Clea, but there will be some others that are of less literary interest but connected with this overall tradition, like the Burden of Isis, that we'll be using. So this time, though, we're going to talk about some other stories that are classics and that are fairly well known, were fairly well known in Egypt, and are fairly well known in modern times since their rediscovery, but are not part of this great tradition about Osiris and Horus, which is the one that probably we all know best, or that people have heard of, are more likely to have heard of. So, the first of these that we're going to talk about is a story called the Famine Stela. And the source that I'm going to use for that, the book that I'm going to use for that, of course, is The Literature of Ancient Egypt from Yale University Press. But some of the others, we're going to use this book by E.A. Wallace Budge, Legends of the Egyptian Gods. So this book is more dated, of course, but by about 100 years, but the stories that I'm going to be talking about in it are ones that I don't have in another book, so we'll just use this one. But anyway, the first is the Famine Stela, and what this is, what the stela itself is a stone surface on which you find an inscription. Usually a stela consists of a royal decree or a dedicatory notice of some kind, but it's declaring something and it's set in stone for all to read, so the Famine Stela was found at the island of, well, it's associated with the island of Elephantine, which is in the district where modern-day Aswan is, where they built the Aswan Dam. And today, Egypt extends a little bit south of there, although it's in the very far south of the country. But in antiquity, that was the southern frontier of Egypt. So upstream on there from the Nile, you were in Nubia once you got past Elephantine. And which god was the patron of that district? It was the god Khnum, and usually that's spelled Khnum. And he's usually shown with the head of a ram, not a ram that we would recognize, but one that is probably extinct today, but did exist or had recently existed in antiquity. And it has horns that extend like that out from its head in sort of a wavy, with a wavy shape or design. And here's an image, again from the Larousse Encyclopedia of Mythology, in the section on Egyptian mythology, showing a god, not Khnum, but Ra, actually, in the sun boat, with the head of a ram just like that. You can see the horns go out side to side and they're kind of wavy. So Khnum was associated with sometimes he was thought to have made humans, or he's shown making humans on a potter's wheel, but also he was associated with the Nile flood, because the Nile entered Egypt from his district in the far south. So the Famine Stela was probably written, well, we know it was written in the Ptolemaic period, which was the reign of the kings descended from Alexander the Great, kings and queens, I should say. not descended from Alexander the Great, but from Ptolemy the son of Lagos, who was a close associate of Alexander the Great. And of course, he took over Egypt shortly after Alexander's death in 323 BC, and his descendants reigned until around 30 BC when the Romans conquered Egypt. So, this text that we're going to talk about is from that time, and it probably was put up in the temple of Khnum in order to make a claim that the priests of Khnum had a claim to the taxes and to contributions from the people in the surrounding area, which was known as the Dodeka Skoinoi, the 12 Skoinoi, which was a unit of the measurement of land. So in this area around the island of Elephantine, the priests of Khnum wanted to make sure they got their contributions because there was another temple, the great temple of Isis at Philae, which was very important at this period of time, and so it was kind of a rival to the temple of Khnum. So to make sure everybody knew that their god was the best and that he had saved Egypt in a time of great famine, the priests of Khnum had this stela inscribed in the Ptolemaic period. But the story it tells takes place in the 3rd dynasty, in the reign of King Djoser, or Zoser. Now, that's interesting because Zoser, or Djoser, was buried in the first pyramid, the very first of them all, the one that started the whole thing with pyramids. And I'll find a picture of it in the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt, which we use a lot. And here it is, the step pyramid of King Djoser at Saqqara. Saqqara, that's a place where some of the early tombs of the great, powerful individuals in Egypt are found. You can see in the forefront here, the foreground, we have part of a complex where they would have festivals, and then in the background, you have the step pyramid of King Zoser. And his vizier Imhotep was the architect of that pyramid. And so it has steps. You can see it's not straight-sided. It has steps. And from there, they learned how to make them more and more perfectly until you got things like that, the Great Pyramids of Giza. And also, before that step pyramid, at Saqqara, they were building tumuli, sort of mound-style tombs like this, also with steps leading up. So you can see how that whole thing progressed. But anyway, our story, the Famine Stela, is about Zoser, the king buried in the step pyramid. And what happens is that there's a famine, and the king wants to know what to do about it, and so they find out that because Khnum is the god who is worshipped in the district where the Nile enters Egypt, they have to restore his worship to its former glory, and he'll be pleased with them, and he'll let the Nile come in full flood so that they can get a good crop. Now, in Genesis, we see that Joseph, the son of Jacob, when he's acting as vizier of Egypt, he finds out that there's going to be, in a dream, he finds out there's going to be 7 good years and 7 bad years. So sometimes in Egypt they had famines because the Nile flood was too much or too little. The land got swamped or it got parched. And so they were very much concerned that the Nile flood would be just right, that it wouldn't be too much or too little at any given year, because if there was too much or too little, it was dangerous. So what happens in our story again is they give Khnum what he wants, and he gives them a good crop. He gives them a good flood. So the priests in his temple, they had this stela written so everyone would know, if it's not for, if not for our God, we wouldn't have good crops. So make sure to give us your contributions and not the guys at the temple down the street, so. Now, that story, again, the Famine Stela, it's sometimes called the tale of the 7 years famine. But another one that we're going to be reading, or we're going to be talking about here, is from a papyrus that was given to a British museum scholar by a native Egyptian provincial official under the British colonial government in the 1860s. And he's supposed to have found this at Deir el-Bahri, where some of the New Kingdom royals were buried. And it's a text from the New Kingdom. And it has to do with the god Ra, or Ra-Atum. I'll show a picture of him. Sometimes he's called Re, R-E, sometimes it's Ra, R-A. But anyway, he's a sun god, and he was worshipped at the city of Heliopolis, which in the Bible is called On, O-N. The Greeks called it Heliopolis, city of the sun, because they worshipped a sun god there. So here's a picture of Ra. He's got a ram's head. Sometimes he's shown with a man's head or a hawk's head or whatever, but often he's combined, like in this story that we're going to talk about, the history of creation. He's combined with this god Atum. Here's a picture of Atum. So, in our story, he's Ra-Atum. When they combine him with someone else, they give him a hyphenated name, which is something the Egyptians commonly did with their gods, because in every district they had a different god. And whoever was king, of course, would make the worship of his own god more prominent than all the others. So, in this history of creation, what happens is that Ra, he brings into being a family, a small family of beings, of gods, called the Heliopolitan Ennead, the group of 9 from Heliopolis. So there are 9 of them, and Ra's their father. And he himself first comes into being from a primordial chaos, from what they call the waters of Nun, N-U-N, like the word nun. But it doesn't refer to a religious sister, it refers to these waters that existed before the earth came into being. So Ra-Atum comes up out of the waters, and he brings everything else into being from, to put it delicately, from his seminal matter, although the text puts it much more explicitly. So you can see that this is a very physical understanding of creation, or at least a very physical way of explaining it. Whereas in other parts of Egypt, in other mythological traditions, they will describe it, for one thing, it'll be a different god creating everything, and for another thing, they'll describe it in a more intellectual way, or at least not in such a powerfully physical way. So, that's the history of creation. That's one of these texts in this book by Budge, but another one is the story of the destruction of mankind, and what happens in that. And it's interesting to note that it's not a story of a flood, which is something you don't find in Egypt, although you find it in many other cultures. I don't know why that is, but you just don't. And instead, there's a story where Ra decides that people are disrespecting him because they think he's grown old and he's not so powerful anymore, and they're saying that his bones are like gold, or his skin is like gold, and his hair is like silver, and his bones are like lapis lazuli, which is a semi-precious stone that they liked a lot in Egypt. So, of course, those are good things, but it's disrespectful for the people to be comparing their god to those things. And so he decides he's had it, he's going to wipe them all out. And he's going to do that using a daughter of his, the goddess Hathor, and sometimes she's called his eye, the eye of Ra, which is a certain, I guess, his power to destroy is how you might think of that. So she's also often combined with the goddess Sekhmet, who is shown with the head of a lion, or a lioness, of course. And I got a good picture of her in here, if I could find it, a good statue of her. But she goes down to the earth and starts wiping everybody out, and she's like a rampaging, roaring lioness wiping everybody out, and eventually she's done such a good job that Ra feels sorry for everybody, and he wants to call her off and spare the few people that are left. Yeah, here's a good statue of Sekhmet there. You can see she's got a lioness head. She's sitting on a throne. So he wants to get her to relent and stop killing everybody. But she's just drunk with blood, and she's not gonna. You can't reason with her at this point. So they got to stop her somehow. They don't know what to do. So what they end up doing is they go to a pool of blood that she's going to drink from. She's just going to drink up all this blood. And what they do is they spike it with beer, so she gets intoxicated and falls asleep. And then when she wakes up, she's come out of it, and her rage has been mollified by this blood beer. So the few of us that are still alive, we're okay now, but we know better than, we're not going to say that Ra is like gold and silver anymore. So that's the legend of the destruction of mankind. And that story was found, I believe, in the tomb of Seti I, a New Kingdom pharaoh, who reigned right before Ramesses II, so in the early 13th or late 14th century BC. So both of these stories that we've told are from the New Kingdom so far. Now this next one is the story of, what does Budge call it? The story of Isis and Horus, or Isis and Ra, or something, Ra and Isis. But I first encountered this story under the name The Secret Name of Ra, because what happens is Ra, who again in this story, like the others that we've talked about, is the leader and the ruler of the gods, he has grown old and he's become decrepit, so he's like this doddering old man. And the goddess Isis, who is always very clever and uses all kinds of tricks and devices to get an advantage over everybody else, she wants to somehow get power over Ra, or get an advantage over him. And she knows that he's old and vulnerable, so what she does is she makes a little snake. She's got a lot of magic knowledge, so she makes a little snake and she brings it to life, and she puts it where Ra is going to pass by in his chariot. And of course he gets bitten and he gets sick. So now he needs someone to cure him, and nobody knows how to do it. None of the other gods can help him, but they know Isis can probably help because she's really good with all of this. So they call in Isis, and what she's all about, what she's out to do here, is to get Ra's secret name, because everybody's got a secret name, not because we live under an assumed identity, but because we have this, there's a key to the knowledge and power over individuals, and if you can get it, then you have an advantage over them, you have power over them. So Isis wants to know Ra's secret name. So she tells him, I can't help you unless you tell me your secret name. And what does he say? He doesn't want to tell her his secret name, of course, so he's going to try and find a way around that. So he keeps on saying things like, well, I'm like this, I'm like that, and I'm great in this way, and I'm great in that way, and I did this, and I did that, I created the world, and I make the sun go rise and set, so. And of course Isis tells him each time, well, that's not good enough, you got to tell me your secret name. And finally she prevails upon him to tell her, and then he whispers it into her ear. We, the reader, we don't find out what that is. So then she has the most power after that, even though she's not, he's the king of the gods, but Isis, she's so clever, she finds out a way to get power even over Ra. So that is the story of Ra and Isis. And the only other one in this book by E.A. Wallace Budge, that I wanted to describe here is something called, what does he call it? Well, I first encountered it under the name The Princess of Bakhtan. And what happens is that there's a lady in Bakhtan, which was in Palestine or the Levant somewhere, and in the New Kingdom, that was part of the sphere of influence of Egypt. And so this woman, is afflicted by an evil spirit. She's possessed by an evil spirit, you could say. So nothing works. No one's able to to force the spirit out of her. And finally, what they do is they bring an image. When word of this gets to Egypt, they bring an image of the god Khons. Baj calls him Kensu. And that image is able, the god, through his image is able to banish the evil spirit. And of course, it makes a great shriek or a great hue and cry as it departs. And so it's sort of a story of an exorcism. And of course, it comes from an inscription, I believe, in a temple of this god whose image is supposed to have expelled this evil spirit. So those are the texts that I wanted to talk about. So these are some of the more popularly known or some of the favorite or classic tales of the Egyptian gods. So that's just one thing in Egyptian literature. There are other genres that we'll talk about. And next time we'll probably talk about the whole myth cycle of Osiris and all of his family members, his son Horus, his wife Isis, and his evil brother Set. But we'll save that for next time. And so now we are well on our way in our discussion of Egyptian literature, and pretty soon we'll get away from the more religious-minded or mythologically oriented literature. We'll get into all kinds of other stuff. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it's been of some interest to you, and that you'll have a great vigil tonight and a great feast tomorrow, and a great weekend, of course, and probably we'll be back at it again sometime this weekend. But thanks again, and have a nice day.